The neon lights of Axiom Station flickered through the perpetual chemical haze that hung like a shroud over the undercity trading sector. Jax Marlowe pulled his worn synth leather jacket tighter around his lean frame, more out of habit than any real protection it offered against the biting cold that seeped through the station's aging environmental systems. The labyrinthine bazaar stretched before him, a maze of narrow passages lined with makeshift stalls, black market dealers hawking their wares, and desperate outcasts seeking refuge from corporate oversight. This was where the forgotten came to disappear, and Jax had been disappearing for almost 3 standard years now. He checked the cracked display of his wrist unit, credits 237. Barely enough for another week's docking fees, let alone the parts he needed to get the Horizon run operational again. His ship, if you could still call the battered freighter, that was held together by improvised repairs and sheer stubbornness, just like its pilot. Marlowe. The voice cut through the din of the bazaar. Jax tensed hand instinctively, moving to the modified stunner concealed beneath his jacket. He relaxed marginally when he recognized the wheezing figure approaching through the crowd. Mercer, Jax acknowledged with a curt nod. Thought you were dodging repo men after that stunt on Proxima 3. The informant's face split into a yellow-toothed grin. Got friends in low places, speaking of which. Mercer leaned closer, his breath a noxious mix of synthetic alcohol and cheap stimulants. Got something that might interest a man of your flexible morality. Jax's eyes narrowed. I'm listening. There's an auction. Not your usual cargo haul. Sentient curiosities, collectors paying premium rates. I don't deal in sentience. The words came automatically surprising Jax with their vehemence. A moral line he thought he'd crossed years ago when survival first trumped conscience. Mercer raised his hands placatingly. Not asking you to bid. Just thought you might find some well-heeled buyers to schmooze. Maybe lift a credit chip or two while they're distracted by the merchandise. He tapped his temple with a grimy finger. Thinking outside the box, Marlowe. Isn't that how you've survived this long? Jax stared past Mercer at a corporate security drone hovering overhead, its optical sensors sweeping the crowd. His work permit would expire in 48 hours. Without credits or legitimate cargo, he'd be marked for deportation. Or worse. Where and when? He asked finally. Storage Sector 17B, 1 hour. Mercer's grin widened. Knew you'd see reason. Jax watched the informant disappear into the crowd, ignoring the cold knot of unease forming in his stomach. One more compromise. One more line blurred. What difference did it make now? He checked his stunner charge and headed deeper into the undercity. Above him, the corporate logos glowed like artificial constellations. Helix Industries, Monarch Spacefaring Taurus Consolidated, the true rulers of this corner of the galaxy. To them, people like Jax were less than the dirt beneath their towering headquarters. Storage Sector 17B was deliberately difficult to find accessible only through a series of unmarked maintenance corridors that reeked of industrial lubricant and decay. Jax followed Mercer's directions, eventually emerging into a cavernous warehouse where makeshift lighting cast elongated shadows across stacked crates and forgotten machinery. A small crowd had already gathered their expensive attire, marking them as off-station visitors. Wealthy collectors slumming it for exotic acquisitions they could boast about in their pristine orbital mansions. Jax's practiced eye identified at least 3 armed bodyguards among them. Security was tight but discreet. No one wanted authorities interrupting their questionable transactions. At the center of the gathering stood a tall, gaunt figure, dressed in an outdated formal suit. Auctioneer Vaskin, notorious throughout the sector for procuring rare commodities that somehow slipped through regulatory oversight. Distinguished guests. Vaskin began his voice, carrying an artificial modulation that lent an unsettling resonance to his words. Welcome to tonight's exclusive offering. I assure you each specimen has been ethically sourced through legitimate salvage operations. The lie hung in the air, acknowledged and ignored by all present. Jax positioned himself near the back, scanning for potential marks. A corpulent merchant from the Rigel system fingers, adorned with biosensor rings. A tall woman whose ocular implants gleamed too brightly, suggesting military-grade enhancements. All possibilities, but all too alert for his usual sleight of hand. The first few lots were unremarkable. A crystalline life form that responded to musical tones, a collection of parasitic orchids that communicated through pheromones. Jax watched with feigned interest, calculating escape routes and security response times out of habit. "And now," Vaskin announced with theatrical flourish, "our special acquisition." Two attendants wheeled forward, a rust-stained cage roughly 1 meter cubed. Inside, curled into a defensive ball, lay what appeared to be a small drake, a reptilian creature similar to those Jax had glimpsed on frontier worlds. Its scales were dull gray, lacking the iridescent sheen typical of its kind. More noticeably, where wings should have extended from its shoulders, there were only ragged scars. A juvenile specimen of the supposedly extinct Draconis variation, Vaskin continued. Note the characteristic dorsal ridges and enhanced forelimb dexterity, unfortunately damaged during acquisition, hence the missing flight appendages, but still a remarkable example. The collectors murmured appreciatively, but Jax noticed their interest was perfunctory at best. A damaged specimen held limited appeal, regardless of rarity. Vaskin seemed to sense the tepid response, quickly adding, "Initial neural scans suggest rudimentary sentience, possibly trainable for basic tasks." Jax found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't articulate. The creature remained motionless, appearing either unconscious or severely weakened. Its breathing was shallow, barely perceptible. "Opening bid at 5,000 credits, Vaskin announced. The silence that followed was telling. 4,000 then, he amended, a hint of desperation creeping into his modulated voice. Surely, 2,000, someone called from the back. A token bid more to move the proceedings along than genuine interest. Vaskin's face tightened. 2,000 from the gentleman in blue. Any advance on 2? As Jax hovered at the edge of the crowd, the creature's eyes suddenly snapped open, startling amber irises with vertical pupils that contracted sharply in the harsh light. Those eyes locked onto Jax with unnerving intensity, as if seeing through the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. In that moment, something shifted inside him, a recognition of something familiar in this alien gaze. Not just intelligence, but awareness, comprehension. The creature extended a trembling claw and deliberately scratched 3 intersecting lines and a circle into the grime coating the floor of its cage. A symbol, a deliberate communication. Going once at 2,000, Vaskin intoned. The drake's eyes remained fixed on Jax, unblinking, pleading. Going twice. 3,000, Jax heard himself say. The words seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, bypassing all rational thought. Vaskin's eyebrows rose slightly. 3,000 from the gentleman in the back. Any advance? The original bidder shrugged, uninterested in a bidding war over damaged merchandise. Jax felt the creature's gaze boring into him through him. Sold for 3,000 credits, Vaskin announced with poorly concealed relief. Jax's heart hammered against his ribs as the reality of what he'd done crashed over him. 3,000 credits he didn't have. For a creature he couldn't keep. In a station he needed to leave. All because of some ancient instinct he thought he'd buried years ago. The transaction was completed with unsettling efficiency. Retinal identification, digital transfer of non-existent funds, courtesy of an identity fabrication chip Jax had been saving for emergencies, and a cursory ownership certificate transferred to his comm unit. The cage was remarkably light as he carried it away from the auction site, the creature inside now eerily still. It wasn't until he reached the relative safety of a service corridor that panic truly set in. Corporate security would flag the fraudulent transfer within hours. Vaskin's enforcers would come looking for their payment or their property. And Jax's ship wasn't even capable of atmospheric exit, let alone interstellar travel. He'd just signed his own exile warrant, or worse. "What the hell was I thinking?" he muttered, setting the cage down carefully. The Drake shifted slightly, those amber eyes, watching him with undiminished intensity. Jax crouched to examine his impulsive acquisition more closely. Beneath the dull scales, he could see evidence of malnutrition and mistreatment. The wing scars were surgical, not accidental. Deliberate amputation. Someone had wanted this creature grounded. "I can't help you," Jax said aloud, unsure why he was speaking to it as if it could understand. "I can barely help myself." The Drake tilted its head slightly, then scratched at the cage floor again. The same 3 lines intersecting with a circle. When Jax didn't respond, it repeated the motion more emphatically. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jax whispered. A sudden clatter at the end of the corridor sent him into a defensive crouch. Footsteps, approaching rapidly. Discovery already. In a split-second decision that defied logic, Jax grabbed the cage and ran in the opposite direction toward the lower docking bays, where the Horizon run waited. If he was already marked, he might as well commit fully to this madness. The normally quiet corridors leading to Bay 37 were mercifully empty. Jax punched in his access code with trembling fingers, the cage clutched awkwardly under one arm. The Drake remained silent, as if sensing the need for stealth. The Horizon Run's airlock hissed open, reluctantly revealing the cluttered interior of what had once been a respectable mid-range hauler. Now, it was more junkyard than spacecraft, with exposed conduits and makeshift repairs visible throughout the cramped cabin. "Home sweet home," Jax muttered, securing the hatch behind them. "For however long we've got." He set the cage down on the pilot's chair and found the release mechanism. His hand hesitated over it. What if the creature was dangerous? What if its docility was merely a ploy? Those amber eyes watched him unblinking. "This is insane," Jax whispered and triggered the release. The cage door swung open with a metallic creak. Neither human nor Drake moved for several tense seconds. Then, with deliberate caution, the creature emerged. It was smaller than Jax had initially thought, perhaps the length of his forearm, from snout to tail tip. Up close, the scars where wings had been removed were even more pronounced. Professional work designed to heal without infection. Valuable merchandise modified for convenience. Anger flared unexpectedly in Jax's chest. The Drake made its way carefully across the cluttered console, examining switches and displays with evident curiosity. It paused at the navigation panel, where a star chart glowed with the local sector display. To Jax's astonishment, the creature extended a delicate claw and touched specific points on the map, tracing what appeared to be a route through several systems. "You understand this?" Jax asked incredulously. The Drake turned those ancient eyes toward him and made a soft, trilling sound. It returned to the star chart this time, deliberately pressing the sequence that would zoom out to a wider galactic view. When the display shifted, the creature became visibly excited, searching the expanded map with newfound urgency. A sharp knock at the outer airlock shattered the moment. Jax tensed, hand moving to his stunner. "Bay inspection open up." The unmistakable voice of station security. The Drake froze, then scurried beneath the console, watching Jax with evident alarm. "One moment," Jax called, mind racing through options. The fake transaction would have been flagged. They were looking for him, for the Drake. But there might still be a way out. He accessed his emergency cache of forged credentials, selecting the one he'd been saving for the direst circumstances. Cultural attaché for the Pan-Galactic Diplomatic Corps. It wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny, but it might buy him precious minutes. Jax smoothed his jacket, adopted a posture of affronted dignity, and opened the airlock. 2 security officers stood outside, hands resting on holstered weapons. "Gentlemen," Jax began, injecting his voice with practiced authority. "Is there a problem? I'm preparing for departure within the hour." The lead officer, a heavy-set man with cybernetic enhancements visible at his temples, consulted his datapad. "Routine inspection. We've had reports of unauthorized transactions in the lower sectors. I see. Jax presented his forged credentials with practiced nonchalance. As you can see, I'm here on official diplomatic business. My schedule is rather pressing. The officer scanned the credentials, frowning slightly. Cultural attaché, we weren't informed of diplomatic visitors. The nature of cultural exchange often benefits from discretion, Jax smiled thinly. I'm sure you understand. The exchange of artifacts between civilizations is delicate work. The second officer peered past him into the ship. What's that? Jax's heart sank as he realized the Drake had emerged from hiding and was now perched atop the console, watching the proceedings with evident interest. Ah, yes, Jax's mind scrambled for a plausible explanation. A ceremonial gift for the Arcturian embassy. They revere these creatures as symbols of wisdom. The officer stepped forward, hand drifting toward his weapon. Looks like a Draconis variant. Those are protected under Sector Regulation 5291. Indeed, Jax agreed smoothly. Which is why proper diplomatic channels are essential. All the appropriate permissions have been filed with central authority. A complete fabrication, but delivered with unwavering confidence. The Drake, as if sensing the precariousness of the situation, lowered its head in what appeared to be a respectful bow toward the officers. The gesture was so perfectly timed, so deliberate, that even Jax was momentarily stunned. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Interfering with diplomatic couriers was above their pay grade, and potentially troublesome. Your departure clearance, sir, the lead officer asked somewhat less assertively. Scheduled for 0600 tomorrow, another lie. I can forward the confirmation to your units if necessary. That won't be necessary. The officer returned Jax's credentials with obvious reluctance. Enjoy your stay on Axiom Station Attaché. Jax maintained his imperious facade until the airlock sealed shut behind the retreating officers. Only then did he release the breath he'd been holding, slumping against the bulkhead. That was too close, he muttered. The Drake made a soft chirping sound that almost resembled laughter. It had returned to the navigation console and was once again tracing patterns across the star chart. Jax approached cautiously. You helped me back there. You understood what was happening. The creature looked up at him, and in those amber eyes, Jax saw something that transcended the barriers of species. Gratitude. Clear, unmistakable gratitude. You're not just sentient, Jax whispered. You're intelligent, fully conscious. The Drake blinked once, slowly, then returned to the star chart. This time, it deliberately traced a path to an unmarked region at the edge of charted space. Is that where you're from? Jax asked. Another slow blink, affirmation. Well, we've got a problem then. Jax gestured around the cabin. This ship isn't going anywhere. Tachyonic converter is fried, navigation array is held together with patch code, and life support is running at 60% capacity at best. The Drake tilted its head considering this information. Then, with surprising agility, it leapt from the console and scurried toward the engine access panel. It looked back at Jax expectantly. You want to see the engines? Jax asked incredulously. The creature made an impatient chirping sound. Curiosity, overcoming caution. Jax opened the access panel. The Drake immediately disappeared into the tangle of wires and components that constituted the Horizon Run's propulsion system. Alarmed, Jax dropped to his knees, trying to spot the creature amidst the machinery. Hey, get out of there before you electrocute yourself. A series of metallic clinks and scrapes emanated from deep within the access tunnel. For several minutes, Jax could only wait anxiously, catching occasional glimpses of a tail or claw, as the Drake moved with purpose through the engine compartment. Finally, the creature emerged, scales, now smudged with engine grease, but eyes bright with what could only be described as satisfaction. What did you do? Jax demanded, rushing to check the engine status. To his astonishment, the diagnostic panel showed the tachyonic converter at 89% efficiency, higher than it had been since he'd acquired the vessel. Somehow, this creature had repaired what Jax had been unable to fix for months. How? he breathed, staring at the Drake with newfound respect. The creature merely chirped, then pointed insistently at the navigation console. Jax ran a full system diagnostic confirming that the repairs were real and stable. Somehow, this wingless Drake had not only understood the problem, but had implemented a solution that exceeded the converter's original specifications. "You're full of surprises," Jax murmured, reaching out tentatively. The Drake allowed his touch, its scales warm and slightly textured beneath his fingertips. "I think we need a name for you. Can't keep calling you creature or Drake if we're going to be traveling together." The Drake tilted its head, considering this. "How about Cipher, since you're such a puzzle?" The newly named Cipher made a trilling sound that Jax interpreted as approval. No, Jax corrected himself mentally. They returned to the navigation console once again, indicating the unmarked region of space. "You want to go there?" Jax asked. "It's beyond the edge of charted space. No support stations, no emergency beacons. Just void." Cipher's gaze was unwavering. A proximity alert suddenly blared through the cabin. Jax checked the external sensors and felt his blood turn to ice. Corporate security vessels were converging on the docking bay. Not just station security. Actual Helix Industries enforcement ships. "They've figured out the fraud," he muttered. "Time to see if your repairs hold Cipher." Jax slid into the pilot's seat, initiating emergency launch protocols. Alarms wailed as he overrode safety interlocks and bypassed departure clearance. The Horizon Run shuddered ominously as ancient engines powered up, fighting against docking clamps that had yet to release. "Come on, you piece of junk," Jax growled, rerouting power from life support to the thrusters. Cipher watched intently, occasionally chirping suggestions that Jax somehow understood despite the language barrier. The docking clamps finally disengaged with a metallic screech. Jax didn't wait for confirmation, pushing the thrusters to maximum and sending the Horizon Run hurtling from the bay in a barely controlled burn. Warning shots from security vessels flashed past the viewport. "Hang on!" Jax shouted as he executed a dangerous roll to avoid incoming fire. Cipher braced against the console, surprisingly adept at compensating for the sudden maneuvers. The Horizon Run bucked and protested as Jax pushed it beyond its design parameters, weaving through the chaotic traffic of Axiom Station's outer rings. Corporate vessels pursued their superior engines, gaining ground despite his evasive tactics. "We need a jump point," Jax muttered, searching the navigation display for options. "Nearest safe exit is—" Cipher interrupted with an urgent chirp, indicating a specific vector on the display. One that would take them dangerously close to the station's reactor shielding. "That's suicide," Jax protested. "The radiation alone would—" The Drake's eyes locked with his, filled with certainty that transcended words. "Trust me," they seemed to say. Against all rational judgment, Jax adjusted course. The Horizon Run dove toward the massive reactor housing that powered Axiom Station, its shields already whining in protest at the increasing radiation levels. Corporate vessels fell back, unwilling to risk the potential damage. "Now what?" Jax demanded as warning alerts cascaded across his console. Cipher scrambled to the ship's rudimentary sensor array, manipulating controls with surprising dexterity. The main display suddenly revealed what the Drake had somehow known: a maintenance portal, cycling open for a routine drone inspection. "You've got to be kidding me," Jax breathed. But he was already adjusting course, aiming for the momentary gap in the station's defenses. The Horizon Run scraped through the portal, with centimeters to spare, alarms blaring as external sensors registered minor hull damage. They emerged into open space on the far side of the station, momentarily hidden from pursuing vessels. Jax didn't waste the advantage, immediately plotting a jump to the nearest system. "Hold on, Cipher. This is where we find out if your repairs were thoroughgoing." The hyperspace engines engaged with a resonant hum that was steadier than Jax had heard in years. The stars elongated around them as the Horizon Run tore a hole in reality itself, slipping between the cracks of normal space into the shimmering tunnel of hyperspace. For several minutes, Jax could only sit in stunned silence, processing their narrow escape. Sci-Fi moved around the cabin with evident curiosity, examining systems, and occasionally making adjustments that Jax didn't understand, but somehow trusted. "You saved us," he finally said. "You knew about that maintenance portal. How?" Sci-Fi merely blinked those ancient eyes, then returned to the navigation console once again, indicating the unmarked region of space. All right, Jax conceded. "We're headed your way. But we need supplies, and we need to make sure we've lost our pursuit." The journey that followed tested both human and Drake to their limits. At each system, they briefly visited corporate alerts had already been transmitted. Jax's face and the description of his ship were flagged in every legitimate port. They were forced to dock at shadow harbors, asteroid mining outposts, abandoned research stations, the fringes of civilized space where questions weren't asked, as long as payment cleared. Throughout it all, Sci-Fi proved invaluable. The Drake's understanding of ship systems bordered on miraculous, each repair or modification improving the Horizon run beyond its original specifications. More remarkably, Sci-Fi seemed to understand encryption protocols and communication systems with an intuition that Jax couldn't explain. At a derelict fueling station orbiting a gas giant, Jax encountered a cynical vendor selling outdated star charts. The woman eyed Sci-Fi with professional interest. "Unusual pet," she remarked, her cybernetic eye whirring as it scanned the Drake. "Colleague," Jax corrected automatically, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. The vendor smiled thinly. "Sure. Colleague. Seen that species before, though, never without wings. They fetch a good price in certain markets." Sci-Fi tensed, visibly moving closer to Jax. "We're just interested in the charts," Jax said firmly. "Specifically this region." He indicated the blank area that Sci-Fi had repeatedly identified. The vendor's organic eye widened slightly. "The dead zone, nothing out there worth finding, friend." "The charts," Jax repeated, placing credits on the counter. "And whatever information you have on the region." The data crystal he purchased contained little concrete information, mostly speculation and fragmented reports from the few explorers who had ventured into the uncharted area. Terms like navigational anomalies and sensor ghosts appeared frequently. One report mentioned architectural ruins of non-human origin, but provided no coordinates or substantiating evidence. That night, as the Horizon run drifted in the shadow of the gas giant's rings, Jax studied the limited data, while Sci-Fi slept curled on the co-pilot's chair. The Drake had gradually become more comfortable around him, occasionally initiating contact. A head butted gently against his hand, a tail curled around his wrist while he worked on repairs. "What are you?" Jax murmured, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Sci-Fi's breathing. "And what am I going to do with you?" He hadn't intended for Sci-Fi to hear, but the Drake's eyes opened slowly, regarding him with that unsettling intelligence. Sci-Fi rose, stretched in a distinctly feline manner, then approached Jax with purpose. Before he could react, the Drake pressed its forehead against his. A jolt of energy surged through Jax's mind, not painful, but overwhelming in its intensity. Images flooded his consciousness, a vibrant world of crystalline spires and atmospheric flyers, repositories of knowledge encoded in patterns of light, wingless custodians connecting minds across vast distances, and destruction, corporate vessels descending, collection teams with specialized equipment, cultural memories extracted weaponized, wings severed to prevent escape. Jax gasped as the connection broke, finding himself on the floor of the cabin with no memory of falling. Sci-Fi stood before him, those amber eyes now filled with sorrow and urgency. "You're a Varth," Jax whispered, the knowledge somehow planted directly in his mind. "Keepers of cultural memory." Sci-Fi blinked once. "Yes. And the corporations want that memory, for weapons, for technology." Another blink. The Drake scratched at the floor, creating a more complex version of the symbol Jax had first seen in the cage. three intersecting lines with a circle at their center, now surrounded by radiating patterns. That's your people's mark, some kind of identification? Sci-Fi made a frustrated sound, then pressed their forehead against Jax's hand. Another flash of images, this time of a collar barely visible beneath the drake's scales. Not decorative, but functional, a biotechnological interface containing millennia of accumulated knowledge, accessible only to those with the correct mental patterns. They cut off your wings so you couldn't escape with the data, Jax realized aloud. But they couldn't access the information directly. They needed you alive, intact. Sci-Fi's eyes conveyed all the confirmation he needed. Jax sat back processing this revelation. He'd inadvertently stolen, not just a sentient being, but a living archive of an entire civilization. No wonder corporate forces were so determined to recapture them. The unmarked region, he said slowly. That's where the rest of your kind is hiding. Sci-Fi chirped affirmatively, returning to the navigation console to trace the now familiar path. Well, Jax sighed, I guess we're outlaws with a mission now. Their new understanding fundamentally shifted their relationship. Jax no longer saw Sci-Fi as a rescued creature, but as a colleague with a vital purpose. Together, they plotted a course that would take them through the least monitored routes toward the edge of charted space. The Horizon Run performed better with each passing day. Sci-Fi's intuitive understanding of its systems led to modifications that Jax would never have attempted. Rerouting power configurations, optimizing sensor arrays, even enhancing the life support to operate more efficiently. The ship became an extension of their partnership, evolving to meet their needs. They were 3 jumps from the boundary of mapped space when disaster struck. Emerging from hyperspace at a remote navigation beacon, they found themselves facing a corporate dreadnought, a massive enforcement vessel bristling with weapon systems and scanner arrays. How did they find us? Jax hissed, immediately powering down non-essential systems to minimize their signature. There's no way they could have predicted our route. Sci-Fi made an alarmed sound, rushing to the communication array. The Drake's claws moved with blinding speed across the controls, bringing up diagnostic screens that Jax had never accessed before. What is it? The answer appeared on the main display, a tracking algorithm buried deep in the ship's communication protocols, transmitting their location at each hyperspace exit. It had been dormant until their last stop, where a seemingly routine system update from the fueling station had activated it. The vendor, Jax realized grimly. She recognized you and alerted them. The dreadnought was already turning toward their position, its massive engines flaring as it adjusted course. We can't outrun that, Jax stated the obvious. And we can't outgun it. Sci-Fi chirped urgently, indicating the communication array again. The Drake's claws flew across the controls, implementing changes that Jax could barely follow. Lines of code scrolled across the display as Sci-Fi somehow bypassed security protocols and accessed the ship's deepest operating systems. What are you doing? Jax asked, watching in amazement as the Drake essentially rewrote the Horizon Run's communication architecture on the fly. His answer came when the main view screen suddenly displayed the Dreadnought's tactical systems. Somehow, Sci-Fi had hacked into the corporate vessel's secure network, accessing their sensor grid and weapons targeting. That's impossible, Jax breathed. Sci-Fi ignored him, continuing to manipulate the connection. With a series of deliberate commands, the Drake created a cascade of false sensor readings throughout the Dreadnought systems. Suddenly, the massive vessel's scanners showed a dozen identical signatures to the Horizon Run scattered across the local space. On the tactical display, Jax watched as the Dreadnought hesitated, then began pursuing one of the phantom signals in the opposite direction. You beautiful genius, Jax laughed, genuine admiration in his voice. You created decoys. Sci-Fi made a sound that resembled a satisfied purr, but immediately returned to the navigation console, urging Jax to plot their escape while the deception held. They made 3 rapid jumps in succession, pushing the hyperspace engines beyond safety parameters. After the 3rd jump, the Horizon Run emerged into a region of space unlike any Jax had ever encountered. The stars were different here, not just in configuration but in quality of light. Ribbons of cosmic radiation rippled across the void, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their complexity. And there, barely visible at extreme sensor range, was a planetary body that matched no recorded signature in the ship's database. "Is that it?" Jax asked quietly. "Is that home?" Cypher's reaction was subdued. Not the excitement Jax had expected, but a solemn acknowledgement. The Drake traced a claw along the planet's image, then made a series of melancholy chirps. "It's been damaged," Jax interpreted, though he wasn't sure how he understood. Something in Cypher's posture perhaps, or some residual connection from their mental link. The corporations found it before. As they approached the planet, the extent of that damage became apparent. Massive impact craters scarred the surface, consistent with orbital bombardment. Evidence of once great structures lay in ruins across the northern hemisphere. Atmospheric readings showed abnormal patterns indicative of ecological trauma. Yet it wasn't completely dead. Sensors detected energy signatures emanating from a specific region, faint but deliberate like a beacon. "Someone's still there," Jax observed. "Survivors." Cypher chirped affirmatively, directing Jax toward the energy source. Landing protocols were complicated by the planet's unstable atmosphere. Jax compensated as best he could, using techniques he'd learned on frontier worlds with similar conditions. The Horizon Run protested the rough treatment, but held together, settling onto the surface with a series of mechanical groans and a final decisive thump. "External atmosphere is breathable," Jax noted, studying the sensor readings. "But radiation levels are elevated. We shouldn't stay exposed for long periods." Cypher was already at the airlock, waiting impatiently for Jax to follow. The Drake's entire demeanor had changed, a new tension evident in every movement, anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. The planet's surface was a study in devastation and rebirth. Massive crystalline structures lay, shattered, across a landscape of iridescent vegetation that seemed to be reclaiming the ruins. The air carried a copper tang that reminded Jax of blood, yet beneath it was a sweetness he couldn't identify, like flowers he'd never encountered. Cypher moved with purpose through the ruins, occasionally pausing to scratch symbols into surfaces that responded with faint luminescence. Marking their path, Jax realized, or perhaps leaving messages for others. They had walked for nearly an hour when Cypher suddenly froze, head tilted, as if listening. Jax tensed hand moving to his stunner, but the Drake chirped reassuringly. A moment later, Jax heard it too, a faint harmonic resonance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Cresting a ridge, they beheld a sight that stole Jax's breath. A luminous spire rose from the center of a crater, its surface inscribed with countless variations of the symbol Cypher had first shown him. Around its base, perhaps a dozen creatures similar to Cypher moved in coordinated patterns, their wingless forms instantly recognizable. At their appearance, the Varth below ceased their activities. As one, they turned to regard the newcomers, their amber eyes gleaming in the planet's strange light. Cypher made a complex series of chirps and trills that reverberated across the crater. After a moment of silence, the assembled Varth responded in kind, a chorus of alien communication that raised goosebumps along Jax's arms. The largest of the Varth approached, studying Jax with unnerving intensity. Unlike Cypher, whose scales were dull gray, this individual's scales shimmered with subtle iridescence despite the absence of wings. The Varth pressed its forehead against Cypher's in a gesture Jax now recognized as communication, their connection lasting several minutes. When they separated, the elder Varth approached Jax directly. It stopped before him, head tilted, in what appeared to be a gesture of inquiry. "I found Cypher at an auction," Jax explained, feeling strangely compelled to justify himself. "They were being sold as a curiosity. I couldn't leave them there." The Varth considered this, then deliberately extended its head toward Jax. The invitation was clear. With only slight hesitation, Jax knelt and allowed the contact. The mental connection was gentler than his first experience with Sci-Fi, more controlled. Images and concepts flowed into his consciousness. Gratitude for Sci-Fi's rescue explanation of their circumstances. Invitation to understand. The Varth were indeed knowledge keepers their society built around the preservation and sharing of cultural memory. Their collars, biotechnological interfaces grown from their own genetic material, contained the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. This had made them targets when corporate explorers first discovered their world. The initial diplomatic contact had quickly devolved into exploitation attempts. Those Varth who could fly had escaped to the stars, seeking sanctuary among sympathetic civilizations. Those unable to fly, the custodians of the most critical memories, had retreated underground, maintaining the beacon for those who might return. Sci-Fi had been captured during a reconnaissance mission, their wings removed to prevent escape with the valuable data they carried. And now, Jax asked aloud when the connection ended. What happens to Sci-Fi to all of you? The Elder Varth made a series of gestures that Sci-Fi translated through another brief mental connection. The surviving Varth would continue rebuilding, using techniques preserved in their collective memory to eventually restore the planet's ecosystem. They had developed methods to regrow the severed wings of those who had been mutilated, though the process was slow and resource-intensive. Most surprisingly, they extended an invitation to Jax to remain as a liaison to the wider galaxy, to help establish protection protocols and legitimate diplomatic channels that might prevent further exploitation. Me, Jax asked incredulously. I'm a smuggler, a thief. I don't know the first thing about diplomacy. Sci-Fi chirped, what could only be interpreted as laughter, pressing briefly against Jax's side, in a gesture that had become familiar during their journey. The meaning was clear. You saved me when no one else would. You chose compassion when it was difficult. Who better? As the implications settled over him, Jax gazed across the ruins of what had once been a thriving civilization. Corporate greed had reduced it to this: shattered crystal and struggling life. Yet here around the beacon, the Varth continued their work with patient determination, rebuilding, remembering, refusing to be erased. I'd need to modify the ship, he said finally. Set up proper communication arrays, defensive systems. Sci-Fi chirped excitedly, already anticipating the collaborative work such modifications would entail. And I'd need to establish new identities, new channels. The corporations won't stop looking. The Elder Varth made a dismissive gesture, followed by a series of movements that somehow conveyed absolute confidence. With their combined knowledge and Jax's understanding of corporate methods, they could remain hidden while building the foundations for legitimate recognition. It won't be easy, Jax warned. Sci-Fi pressed against his side again, those amber eyes meeting his with unwavering trust. When had this creature, this person, come to mean so much to him? At what point had their escape become a shared mission, rather than an inconvenient obligation? As if reading his thoughts, Sci-Fi chirped softly and scratched the now familiar symbol into the soil, 3 lines intersecting with a circle at their center. Only now did Jax truly understand its meaning: connection, interdependence, shared purpose. All right, he agreed, a smile tugging at lips that had nearly forgotten the expression. Consider me your very unofficial ambassador. In the days that followed, Jax watched in amazement as the Varth began the process of restoring Sci-Fi's wings. Bioluminescent tendrils extended from the Elder's collar, connecting with the scar tissue where wings had been removed. The regeneration would take months, but already new growth was visible, delicate structures forming beneath transparent, protective membranes. While Sci-Fi underwent healing, Jax worked with other Varth to modify the Horizon Run, transforming the smuggler's vessel into something both less conspicuous and more capable. Its sensor profile was altered to register as a different class of ship entirely. Its communication array was enhanced with Varth technology, allowing for encrypted transmissions that corporate systems couldn't detect, let alone decode. Most remarkably, Jax found himself changing as well. The cynicism that had been his armor for so long began to soften in the presence of these beings who had endured so much, yet retained their purpose. Their collective memory included philosophical traditions and ethical frameworks that challenged Jax's limited perspective, expanding his understanding of what was possible. One evening, as Axiom Station's twin suns set over the crystalline ruins, Jax sat beside the regeneration chamber, where Sci-Fi rested. The Drake's amber eyes opened slowly, recognizing him immediately. "The modifications are complete," Jax reported. "We can begin reaching out to potential allies as soon as you're ready." Sci-Fi chirped softly, extending a claw toward him. Jax took it gently, feeling the familiar tingle of mental connection. Images flowed between them, not just of practical plans and strategic considerations, but of shared memories. Their harrowing escape from Axiom Station. The moment Jax had first understood Sci-Fi's true nature. The wonder of discovering this hidden world. And beneath it all, a current of emotion that transcended species barriers. Gratitude, trust, and something Jax had not experienced in longer than he could remember belonging. "We'll make it work," he promised as the connection faded. "We'll protect what you've built here, what you remember." Sci-Fi made a sound that needed no translation, contentment tinged with determination. As he left the regeneration chamber, Jax paused to look up at the emerging stars. Somewhere out there, corporate interests still searched for the prize they believed was theirs, by right of discovery. They would never understand what they had nearly destroyed, not just knowledge or technology, but an entire way of being that valued preservation over exploitation, connection over domination. One impulsive act of compassion had changed everything, for Sci-Fi, for the surviving Varth, and for Jax himself. He had saved a wingless Drake from certain death, only to discover he was the one being rescued. From isolation, from moral compromise, from the slow death of his own humanity. The luminous spire pulsed with rhythmic light, sending its beacon toward the stars. Calling those who had fled. Warning those who would exploit. Promising those who would understand that some treasures couldn't be owned, only shared, protected, and passed forward. As night fully descended, Jax made his way back to the Horizon Run. No longer just a means of escape, but a bridge between worlds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for the first time in years, he would face them not as a fugitive running from his past, but as someone with a future worth protecting. Sci-Fi would soon have wings again, and Jax, in his own way, had found his.